The first thing you hear is wood complaining. Oars knocking hulls in a tight harbor. Men shouting in Latin and Greek over the same command, as if translation itself is a form of panic. And then the hiss, pitch-catching, rope-coughing smoke, the breathy crackle of flame finding purchase. Alexandria, 48 BC, and Julius Caesar is about to set ships on fire. Not as an accident. As a tactic. Somewhere nearby, in a warehouse ledgered by tired hands, a papyrus slip turns brown at the edges. It is not a poem. It is not a map of the stars. It is an inventory tag, an ordinary bureaucratic witness. And that little scorched rectangle is how we enter one of history's loudest arguments. What really burned at Alexandria? When did it burn? And why did the story harden into a single sentence? The library burned, and then keep burning for centuries. Hold that scrap of papyrus in your mind like a warm coin. You can feel the fibers, pressed plant into sheet, the faint ridges where the scribe's reed pen dragged ink across grain. It smells like dust and river mud even before the fire touches it. This is what people forget when they talk about knowledge. Knowledge is not an abstraction. It is cargo. It is payroll. It is warehousing. It is guards at gates. It is lamps and shelves and the patience of someone copying line after line until their wrist aches. And tonight, those things are caught inside a siege. In the Roman war room, if you can call a commandeered building a war room, Caesar is cornered. Not cornered like a man in an arena, but cornered like an engineer whose bridge is about to be taken from him. Alexandria is a city that knows how to fight in streets. Narrow lanes. Rooftops. Alleys that turn an army's formation into a choking queue. Outside, the harbor is not scenery. It is an artery. Whoever controls ships controls grain, troops, messages, and escape. Caesar's objective is brutally simple: do not let the enemy use the fleet against him. There is a ticking clock measured in minutes, the next wave of attackers, the next ship that might ram his position, the next spark that might become a city fire whether he wills it or not. So he chooses a denial tactic older than empires: burn what you cannot hold. Now look around at who else is trapped in this moment. Ptolemy Xii's forces and the Alexandrian factions, urban fighters defending a city whose politics are sharp enough to cut. Dock workers, merchants, scribes, the civilians who do the unglamorous labor that makes a metropolis function. Scholars of the Mausian, paid minds, salaried interpreters, lecturers, editors, copyists, living infrastructure whose value depends entirely on stability and patronage. And hovering over all of them, like a ghost that people will later swear they saw with their own eyes, the Great Library. Or rather, the idea of it. Here is our forensic question, and I want it to stay sharp because the story tries to blur it. Not was Alexandria important. It was. Not did Alexandria have books. It had scrolls by the tens of thousands, and likely more. Our question is narrower, harder, and therefore more honest. In 48 BC, when Caesar's fire rose from the harbor, what exactly burned? How far did it spread? And why did later generations insist on a clean, singular tragedy, one bonfire, one villain, one death of knowledge, when the evidence behaves like smoke, not like stone? To answer that, we have to stop imagining a library as a quiet room with marble and whispering. Ptolemaic Alexandria, in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC, built something more ambitious and more political, a state-backed knowledge machine. It collected, copied, translated. It competed. It bragged. It was tied to imperial power the way a navy is tied to imperial power. The Mausian, think of it as a research institution, was not just shelves. It was salaries. Dining halls where scholars argued over verses and measurements. Lecture spaces. A court culture where patronage could elevate a thinker, or end him. Knowledge lived because someone paid for it to live. And the medium mattered. Papyrus is a gift and a threat. It is light, portable, scalable. It is also flammable. Wooden shelving, oil lamps, dry air, everything in a scroll collection is a negotiation with fire. Stone buildings can stand after a blaze. A collection often cannot. When you picture Alexandria, do not picture a single room. Picture a complex ecosystem: storerooms, copyists' benches, scholars' quarters, cataloging systems, couriers, scribes, guards, and political cover. Because when an institution dies, it rarely dies in one way. And there is another uncomfortable detail we have to place on the table. Libraries are not always innocent. Alexandria's collecting was, by the spirit of the evidence, aggressive. Ships came into harbor and texts were inspected. Some were copied, some were kept. Markets were combed. Rival cities were pressured. Victories created opportunities to absorb other people's intellectual property. The famous cataloguing tradition associated with scholars like Callimachus, his Pinarches, an attempt at total indexing, was not merely academic. It was administrative. It made knowledge governable. A catalogue is a weapon. It tells you what exists, where it sits, who may touch it. So when Caesar lights the harbor, we are not watching the burning of ideas. We are watching the possible burning of a supply chain. And this is where the case file fractures into competing reconstructions. First reconstruction, the warehouse burn. The fire, whether started intentionally or unleashed beyond intention, takes ships and spreads to the waterfront warehouses. And in those warehouses are scrolls, not necessarily the heart of the Mausian, but scrolls as cargo, trade goods, state property in transit, copies being moved, seized texts awaiting processing, bureaucratic records, maybe even a batch intended for scholars. Think of it, scrolls stacked like grain sacks. In this reconstruction, what burns is immense, tragic, unreal, yet not the library in the grand institutional sense. It is still a cultural catastrophe, just not the singular annihilation people later imagine. Second reconstruction, spillover into the royal quarter. The Bruchian area, the royal district where the institutional complex was associated, sits not infinitely far from the harbor activity. Fire in a dense ancient city can behave like a living thing. Wind. Resin. Panic. Secondary blazes started by defenders or attackers. In this reconstruction, the blaze does not politely stop at the waterfront. It creeps, jumps, and bites into parts of the royal complex, perhaps damaging some component of the library's holdings or buildings. Not necessarily obliterating everything, but enough to seed the legend with truth. Third reconstruction, propaganda inflation. Later writers, moralists, and rhetoricians, some hostile to Caesar, some eager for a lesson about Roman violence, inflate a military incident into a symbolic murder of knowledge. They turn a complicated urban disaster into a parable. The conqueror burns the world's mind. It is neat. It is memorable. It is politically useful. It also may not match the messy geography of fire and the messy bureaucracy of where scrolls were actually stored. Now, what does the ancient testimony say? It says enough to disturb us, not enough to satisfy us. Later authors do describe a fire associated with Caesar that destroyed many scrolls. But the accounts vary in scale, in proximity, in specificity. And that's the historian's problem. The loudest stories are not always the closest to the scene. Here is where I ask you to imagine a single scholar in Alexandria that night. Not a famous name. A working mind. His life's work might be a commentary on a poet, a set of astronomical observations, a medical case notebook, a catalogue entry that points to a text he intends to collate. He has no sword. He cannot order ships to move. His weapon is continuity, tomorrow's lecture, next month's stipend, next year's copy. When the air turns acrid and the sky above the harbor glows, he does not know whether the fire reaches his shelves. He knows something more intimate. Everything he loves is written on a pressed plant, and pressed plants burn. And now comes the first twist that people hate, because it denies them closure. Even if Caesar's fire was catastrophic, even if it burned tens of thousands of scrolls, it may not have ended Alexandria's knowledge ecosystem. Consider what we know of continuity. Strabo, writing later, describes the Mausian in a way that suggests survival or at least institutional memory. That does not mean nothing was lost. It means the story cannot end in 48 BC if we want it to be accurate. The tragedy of Alexandria is not one night. It is a long decline punctuated by violence. So let's keep the clock running. Minutes become days, riots, street fighting, the city's factions turning the urban grid into a trap. Then decades, the question becomes whether the Mausian keeps its funding and protection. Because a library is not only a building, it is a payroll. End stipends and you end scholars. End scholars and you end copying. End copying and you end survival. Texts do not die only by flame. They die by neglect, by disinterest, by the silent arithmetic of budgets. Now we open crime scene 2, and the air changes. AD 391. The Roman Empire is Christianizing at the level of law and coercion. Emperor Theodosius I issues anti-pagan edicts. Alexandria's religious politics are volatile. This is a city where mobs can decide policy in the street before policy arrives in a document. Bishops, elites, competing factions, everyone understands that symbols are targets. The Serapeum stands like a challenge. Monumental temple complex. An architectural assertion of an older religious order. And it becomes a focal point in conflict. Christian sources that describe its destruction emphasize idols and cult. They describe a victory over paganism. They describe breaking, purging, transforming space. They do not necessarily linger on catalogues. Here the debate sharpens again into two main reconstructions. Reconstruction A, the Serapeum housed a daughter library. Not the main library of the Bruchian, perhaps, but a significant repository. In this view, AD 391 becomes a direct second burn, another set of holdings destroyed, another hemorrhage of texts. The Serapeum's fall is not only cultural, it is bibliographic. Reconstruction B, the Serapeum was symbolically central, but the major collections were already reduced. The destruction, then, is not a bonfire of countless scrolls so much as a cultural beheading, an announcement that the old intellectual order no longer has protection. And once protection vanishes, scholars disperse. Copying slows. Teaching becomes dangerous or irrelevant. The most final kind of erasure is quiet, the moment an institution cannot reproduce itself. Ask yourself a cold, modern question: what kills a research center faster, one spectacular disaster, or a year of unpaid salaries? What destroys an archive more completely, one fire, or a policy that makes possession of certain texts socially dangerous? The Serapeum's destruction matters because it signals a change in what power will defend. Now, if you've heard the Alexandria story before, you may be waiting for the third act, the Arab conquest, AD 642, and the famous quote, the one that pretends to tidy the entire tragedy into a single line about redundancy and contradiction. It is so clean it almost shines. It also appears in much later accounts, not in early conquest reporting. That absence is not a trivial footnote. It is the difference between testimony and theatre. So what do we do with that story? We treat it like we treat any late, convenient anecdote, as evidence of what later people wanted to believe. A single villain and a single bonfire are easier to remember than a centuries-long unraveling of institutions. Polemic loves simplicity. History rarely offers it. But do not mistake skepticism for denial. The Arab conquest did mean a new administration, new priorities, and a new language of power. Those shifts can accelerate decline without requiring a cinematic blaze. A change in what gets funded and what gets taught is an event as real as any riot. Sometimes the archive dies because the future stops needing it, or stops being allowed to need it. Let's zoom out further, because Alexandria is one case in a much older pattern, memory as infrastructure. Before roughly 3000 BC, prehistory, memory lived in bodies. Chants, apprenticeships, kin networks. Harder to burn. Easier to distort. Lose an elder, lose a library. In the ancient world, writing makes memory scalable and stealable. Archives become strategic targets, palaces, temples, tax records, treaties. You do not just conquer land, you seize ledgers. In the medieval period, AD 500 to 1500, knowledge survives in copying ecosystems, monasteries, madrasas, courts. War and policy decide what gets recopied. Not everything. Only what is valued, permitted, and resourced. In the early modern period, 1450 to 1750, print multiplies texts, but so does censorship. Libraries become national trophies. Archives become instruments of law, taxation, surveillance. The medium changes, the struggle over memory stays. Now I want to bring you back to that scorched inventory slip, because it is the kind of artifact that refuses romance. It does not care about grand narratives. It testifies to logistics. It tells us that scrolls moved through warehouses and ships and bureaucratic hands. That means the question, did the library burn, is partly the wrong question. The more accurate question is, which nodes in the network burned, which nodes lost funding, and which nodes lost protection? Here is the pattern that Alexandria reveals, and it is uncomfortable because it is human. When power is under siege, military, religious, political, leaders treat memory as either ammunition or contraband. They defend it if it serves them. They sacrifice it if it threatens them. They neglect it if it costs too much. And the most irreversible losses happen when institutions lose protection, not merely when shells ignite. So what is the turning point? Not a single match. Not one villain twirling a torch. The turning point is the moment Alexandria stops being a protected intellectual capital and becomes contested urban terrain. In 48 BC, Roman civil war politics dragged the city into a struggle where naval control matters more than manuscripts. In AD 391, imperial religious enforcement and factional street power make cultural institutions targets and trophies. In the centuries that follow, successive administrative shifts, language, patronage, priorities, reshape what kinds of learning are rewarded. The library becomes less a place and more a story people tell about what happens when order breaks. Now we do cost accounting, because myth loves drama but avoids invoices. Blood, street fighting, purges, mob violence, scholars and civilians caught between factions. Treasure, royal funding diverted, buildings repurposed, stipends ended, copying labor diminished. Reputation, a world city rebranded from the where knowledge lives to where knowledge died. That reputational shift matters because it changes what later cultures imagine learning to be: fragile, doomed, always one tyrant away from ash. And what about lost science? We do not claim that all science was lost in one fire. That is the romance of catastrophe. What we can say, plausibly, is more specific and therefore more chilling: variant copies vanish. Commentaries vanish. Local datasets vanish, astronomical observations kept in one workshop, medical case notes kept by one school, minority traditions that never win the copying lottery. These are not headline masterpieces. They are the connective tissue that lets later generations build rather than restart. Civilization advances on accumulated margins. Now, we have to be disciplined about what we know and what we merely want. What we can say confidently: fires and violent events happened. Collections were vulnerable. Alexandria's knowledge ecosystem declined over centuries. What remains disputed: whether Caesar's fire reached the main library, the existence and scale of a Serapeum daughter library, and the historicity of the AD 642 burn story as commonly quoted. Our method here is probability gradients, not absolutes, because history is evidence under stress. So let me debate the big perspectives plainly, as if we're in a war room arguing over a map. Perspective 1: Caesar burned the library. This view emphasizes ancient mentions of scroll losses tied to Caesar's harbor fire and treats the library as either physically close enough or logistically connected enough to be devastated. It's emotionally persuasive because it gives us a decisive moment and a famous culprit. Its weakness is precision: it often collapses warehouses, annexes, storerooms, and the main institutional complex into one undifferentiated library, and it assumes a totality the evidence struggles to support. Perspective 2: Caesar burned scrolls, not the library. This view keeps the disaster real but locates it primarily at the waterfront, warehouses, shipping areas, scrolls as cargo. It allows for severe loss while leaving room for later continuity suggested by descriptions like Strabo's. Its weakness is that it can underplay how interconnected the logistics were. If the city scroll traffic and administrative records burned, the institution could be wounded even if the main building stood. Perspective 3: the real destruction was later, and quieter. This view sees 48 BC as one hit among many, and places the decisive damage in the long erosion of patronage, political protection, and safety, especially around AD 391 and beyond. It fits the pattern of how institutions actually die. Its weakness is narrative: it denies us one dramatic end, and audiences often resist that because slow collapse feels less real than fire. But slow collapse is often more real. And the fourth, the most seductive and most suspicious: AD 642, one quote, one bonfire. This view persists because it offers clean moral architecture. It also aligns conveniently with later polemics. But its late appearance and absence from early reporting makes it historically shaky. It tells us more about later anxieties than about the 7th century record. Now, take a breath with me, because here is where the case resolves, not into certainty, but into something more useful. Alexandria did not lose its memory in a single night. It lost it the way humans usually lose irreplaceable things, by mixing emergency decisions with political revenge, and then letting the institution's life support, money, safety, copying, teaching, fail over time. And that is why the scorched inventory slip matters more than any romantic painting of flames licking marble. The slip is a reminder that knowledge lives in systems. It moves through hands. It depends on budgets. It survives through repetition. If you want to destroy memory, you can burn shelves. Or you can do something subtler, make the work impossible, unfashionable, illegal, or unpaid. Now look into the present, because this is not a museum story. Today we store memory in data centers, in the cloud, in platforms that feel immortal because we cannot see the servers. But war can cut cables. Sanctions can block access. Sabotage can erase backups. Policy can turn a switch and make a library vanish from your country overnight. Alexandria's lesson is not that papyrus burns. It is that centralization plus conflict create single points of failure. Change the medium, keep the vulnerability. And censorship has evolved. You do not have to burn a book to erase it. You can bury it under noise. You can de-rank it. You can defund the institutions that teach it. You can make it socially dangerous to cite. That is the modern Serapeum problem, the destruction of a symbol that signals what is no longer safe to know. And then there is propaganda, the temptation of a clean villain. The AD 642 legend shows how societies outsource complexity to a single monstrous story. It is useful. It is memorable. It can also be wrong. Sometimes the myth is the second fire. So here is the verdict, and I want it to sit in your chest the way smoke sits in cloth. Alexandria didn't teach us that knowledge is fragile. It taught us that in a crisis, someone always decides what deserves to be remembered, and that decision is a form of power. Return, finally, to our artifact, the scorched inventory slip. Not a masterpiece. Not a sacred scripture. Just bureaucracy, browned at the edges. The kind of thing people ignore until it becomes ash. That is how most cultural death begins, not with a grand declaration, but with small, tolerable losses that nobody can afford to fight today. If you want to keep doing this work with me, join the investigation. Subscribe not for more history, but for more case files, episodes where we take famous claims and put them under evidence, motive, logistics, and human fear. And when this video ends, choose the next one on the end screen and keep the trail warm, because the patterns only reveal themselves when you see them twice. Now for the legacy question, and it is not one you can Google. If you were a clerk in Alexandria, ink on your fingers, smoke in your hair, and you could carry only one bundle of scrolls out of the warehouse before the roof fell in, would you save what feeds the state, what heals the sick, or what tells the truth about the people in power?